What's up, outliers? Welcome to Performance Bites for bite-sized insights into complex subjects in health and performance. Today, we're going to take a look into nasal breathing versus mouth breathing. So, obviously, we can breathe through both of those holes, one passage being a little bit larger than the other, and one of the others having a more complex system for our breath. So, before we kind of get into the weeds on that, I want to kind of go over the nervous system and talk about the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system, which this is going to make all this make a lot more sense as we go through it. So first thing is the parasympathetic nervous system. This is called our rest and digest. So this is more of like a calming feeling that helps our body relax, helps our mind relax, helps everything kind of chill out. Also very important for digestion, hence the rest and digest. So big for recovery and sleep. Meanwhile, the sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight, which is a lot more of what people are familiar with in, athletics, survival, or just kind of in the zeitgeist. We hear about fight or flight a little bit more often. So that's the big two, and we need to remember what those ones are, because as we get into nasal breathing versus mouth breathing, it's going to come up a lot. So we're going to first go over nasal breath because it's kind of the proper way to breathe. So ideally speaking, we would be breathing through the nose and exhaling either out the nose or the mouth. And what that's essentially doing is regulating our nervous system a little bit more so than it is like heightening just like the fight or flight system, which tends to be the thing that most people are kind of stuck in day to day because chronic stress, life stress, stuff like that. So the biggest thing with the nasal breathing is that when we breathe through our nose, it goes into our sinuses, down our trachea, into the lungs, into the alveoli, and then they're going to dispense that oxygen into the blood and then goes through the blood to our tissues. Very important. So with that, there's a lot of things that are happening in that process. So the first thing that is happening when it goes through the nostrils is that the air is being filtered. So dust particles, bacteria, stuff like that is going to be filtered, caught. That's why we have sticky stuff in here, is to kind of help catch those things and make sure they don't enter our system. The next thing is that it humidifies the air. So the air can be fairly dry. It can also be fairly humid depending upon where you live. Where I live is very dry. So nasal breathing is going to help humidify the air, not because of the nasal passage, but because of the sinuses. There's moisture in there. It's also just a longer road into the system than through the mouth. So it's going to get up to temperature for the body. The body roughly 97 to 98 degrees. There's a lot of variables with that, but with breathing and everything, we want to make sure that that oxygen and air is close to the temperature of the inside of the body. It helps to actually increase the oxygen uptake at the lungs. So humidifies, very, very important. One of the biggest things that nasal breathing does, however, is it increases the nitric oxide intake into our body. So how it does that is pretty darn cool. So nitric oxide, or NO, as I'll continue to call it, with NO, it actually is synthesized in our sinuses, and that is happening through an enzyme which is called NO synthasase. So that enzyme actually helps to produce it, and then we're able to bring it into our system. So that's pretty darn cool. Things like L-arginine, which is a amino acid, oxygen, and other cofactors also play into that process. However, if we simplify it, we breathe in through the nasals, and then that air is going to mix with the NO and bring it into the system of the lungs, and then into the blood, and then out to the tissue, which is going to be wonderful because it's actually a vasodilator, which is going to promote better blood flow, more relaxation, and depending upon what you're doing, if you're relaxing or you're in activity, it's actually going to help in both states. So whether you're just chilling like I am, or you're out running, a 10K, it's going to be really helpful to have better circulation. NO, which that's like a lot of like pre-workouts tend to have NO in them. Because of that, it gets it into the system. It increases that exact same way, but a natural way to do it is just to increase your nasal breathing. So that's pretty cool. Now, something that I didn't even know in my research, I actually learned about this a little bit more. NO is the first line of defense to virus, bacteria, and fungi in the sinuses. So it essentially is an antimicrobial thing. So when those viruses or bacteria enter the nasal passages, the nitric oxide is able to actually eliminate them, which is going to be our first line of defense towards anything that's going to go into our system. And then our immune system would have to fight, which the immune system should be capable of fighting off many of those things. But why put the stress if we can just stop it at the door, essentially? So we can call NO the bouncer of the nasals, and keeps that nasty stuff from actually getting into our system, which I thought was pretty darn cool, because that's a really important part of our overall well-being, is just staying healthy and not ill, right? So another thing is that it will actually increase the oxygen absorption in the lungs, which is going to be wonderful. I kind of mentioned when the air isn't humidified and up to temperature, that also decreases the uptake of oxygen in lungs. So when it's cold and dry out, like it is here often during this time of the year, oxygen is a little bit harder to uptake if I'm not taking it in through my nose, because I'm not getting it up to temperature and humid, and then I'm breathing, but I'm not actually taking in as much oxygen into the system. So the last thing is nasal breathing promotes diaphragmatic breath. So our diaphragm is essentially the top of our core muscles. So our core muscle, full 360, we have a pelvic floor, which is the base, and the diaphragm is the lid up top. So the diaphragm works essentially to help us breathe. It's similar-ish to how a syringe pulls air in when you pull it out. So it's sucking that air in. And then when we plunger it back out, it pushes air back out. So our lungs aren't necessarily actually filling up just on their own. It's the diaphragm that is facilitating a lot of that. Now, we can breathe through like our chest or our neck, collarbones and stuff, where we see a lot of like elevation happening up here with our breath. Ideally speaking, we would be breathing downwards, more into the belly and through the diaphragm, which is a much more relaxed state. Time and place for everything, of course, and we'll talk about that nuance. But with proper function of the diaphragm, we're going to get a lot better overall posture. We're going to have better core activation, and we're going to have better athleticism. So we don't want to sleep on the diaphragm. It's a pretty important thing. So if we can help it actually function properly and breathe properly through the mechanisms with nasal breathing, I don't see why that's not, something we want to do. Obviously, we don't want to be sitting at our desk, working all day, whatever it is, and breathing out our mouth and having people hear us pant like a dog or something like that. So it's obviously going to be a really important thing to master nasal breathing for that rest and digest parasympathetic state. Now, nasal breathing for performance. There's a lot of nuance in this, and this is where like mouth breathing will come into play a little bit, but there's, as I said, nuance. First thing I actually want to talk about is the proper exchange of oxygen and CO2. So when we breathe in, we're bringing in oxygen, and we're exhaling CO2 and vapor, water, H2O, which is hydrogen attached to oxygen, right? So when we are doing that, we're actually getting triggers for breath via CO2, not via oxygen. So the body, when there's high levels of CO2 in the system, that's actually what's going to trigger you to breathe over needing oxygen. So that's a big thing that is kind of misunderstood a little bit, is that we actually breathe the off gas CO2 rather than breathe to intake oxygen. Now, oxygen is very important, but the mechanisms in the body is actually triggered through our tolerance of CO2. So pretty neat. So that gets into this more science-y type stuff here. So bear with me. We're going to go slow through it. So the Bohr effect. This is a super important piece of all of this. So essentially what the Bohr effect is how pH and CO2 concentrations influence our oxygen. As I was saying, we breathe because of CO2 influence. We don't breathe because of oxygen need. Now, pH stands for potential hydrogen. That's something that I wasn't even taught in school. That's something I had to learn later on. But if you're unfamiliar with what pH actually stood for, it's potential hydrogen. So O2, oxygen, binds to hemoglobin, which is a protein circulating in our body through blood. And so we want a lot of hemoglobin so that we can have more oxygen attached to it, and then we get better circulation of oxygen, and then we can get the oxygen to split and actually go onto the next thing, which would be our cells. And we use it for energy and life. So how the Bohr effect essentially comes into play here is when we have an ideal ratio of CO2 and oxygen in the system, the hemoglobin's affinity to oxygen can actually increase, and we can offset the oxygen into the cells and actually use the oxygen to maximize performance, maximize our cellular health, and all that good stuff. So kind of makes a lot of sense, right? So a lot of different things going on here, but when we are in a stress state or a exercise state, let's say for the sake of performance, the increase in CO2 is going to happen because our energy is dependent upon carbon. So like glucose, which is a big energy fuel for us, is actually a 6-carbon molecule. So it's just 6 carbons bound together, and then there's splitting of it. And so you get carbon floating around essentially. And the body needs to get rid of that carbon, and it also needs to get rid of hydrogen ions. Both of these things actually are going to decrease the pH, which is going to make a more acidic environment in the blood. Now, the body is going to counter that by releasing more oxygen off of the hemoglobin. So this weakens the bond between the two. And it's good that it does that, because typically if your CO2 is high and your hydrogen ions are high in your system, it's because you're doing something that's more physically demanding. So when that happens, you need more oxygen to go to the cells to then produce more energy. So it's like this circular, thing going on here. So now getting into mouth breathing. This is where some of this nuance comes in. So I want to touch on the nuance first before I kind of start talking about the quote unquote like drawbacks to being a mouth breather. So the nuance to it is when we are exercising at a low intensity, it's fairly easy to maintain just nasal breathing, and just focusing on breath through the nose, out the mouth, or through the nose, out the nose. And that's going to happen in low zone type training where maybe you're not exceeding a low zone 3. Everybody's going to have a threshold because CO2 tolerance is different amongst everyone, which that's something that can be worked on through like breath work, which is definitely helpful. But naturally, everyone has different levels of it. So for some people, they might have a harder time nostril breathing in zone 2, 60% to 70% of maximum heart rate. Some people might be able to maintain nostril breathing all the way up through zone 3. It just really depends upon the person. But the nostril breathing is going to maximize performance, while mouth breathing is going to maximize it for a short duration. So here's how this is. Let's say that you're doing a high intensity exercise routine and you're nasal breathing, but your heart rate is getting higher, and the intensity is growing. Your need for oxygen and off-gassing carbon dioxide is going to increase significantly. So the nasal passages are only so big, right? I mean, they're straws compared to the mouth, which is a good size hole. So we can off-gas and intake much more. Now, we lose all the good stuff about the nasal breathing, the humidification of the air before it gets in the system. So your amount of oxygen that you're actually absorbing is going to decrease, which is a little bit of a trade-off, but you're able to take it in at a greater rate more rapidly. You can mouth breathe much quicker than nasal breathe as well. So it's this like give and take, but it's almost like a short, high intensity burning fuel. So like a gasoline compared to a diesel, where a gasoline explodes and diesel just burns. So you're going to get what you need, but you're going to run out very quickly. So that high intensity, short burst activity, mouth breathing is totally appropriately fine. That's going to be helpful. Now, if you need to have a decent intensity for longer duration, that's where like the nasal breathing in and the mouth breathing out becomes like a good balance. If you can maximize nasal breathing for as long as possible, say it's a 20-minute bout of high intensity exercise, and if you can do 12 of those minutes with nasal breathing only, and then you break into the mouth breathing and nasal breathing, and then just in the mouth breathing towards the end, that's going to be your best way of doing it compared to just mouth breathing for all of 20 minutes, right? So, like I said, there's a lot of nuance to it. But when we do breathe through the mouth, we're losing that filtration, and we're not getting as much NO as well, which is super important for the sake of performance, because it literally is a supplement that we can take to enhance our performance. So if we're getting less of that NO in our system, our performance is going to decrease. Our oxygen absorption decreases, and we're also going to get more dehydrated, because anyone has gone outside when it's cold and breathe through your mouth, you can see all the vapor that comes out, quite a lot of it. Put your hand in front of it, it will feel wet. So that's something to take into account as well, is dehydration occurs more rapidly through the mouth than it does the nose, which is also happening like when I'm talking right now. Like speaking also is putting vapor in out. So I am also getting dehydrated as I speak, which is why if you have a occupation that you have to talk a lot, your dehydration level can increase due to that. Kind of just like a funny little thing there. You don't have to sweat to get dehydrated. Go figure. So the next thing, this is where it kind of gets back into that Bohr effect, because we can get a hyperventilation through mouth breathing. So going back to that high intensity training, you're 17 minutes into your 20-minute bout, you're purely breathing out the mouth just because you're so gassed. So during hyperventilation, you're essentially off-gassing too frequently. You're going to be getting rid of too much of that CO2 in the system. Now, if we look back to what we're talking about with that Bohr effect, we need CO2 to be present with the hydrogen for oxygen to leave the hemoglobin. Now, when we're off-gassing all of our CO2 in that hyperventilation, we're going to basically decrease the levels in the blood. The oxygen is going to remain binded to the hemoglobin and not going to be released out into the cells for use. This is not good. This is going to lead to a higher pH in blood, so more alkaline rather than more acidic. This is going to basically lower our oxygen uptake and also reduce our performance, because when the body isn't getting what it needs, be it a fuel, like a glucose, or oxygen, super important for the process of glycolysis, aerobic glycolysis, which is when we're breaking down sugar for energy aerobically, we're basically losing our energy, and we're going to start to decrease our output, because the body is essentially going to start governing what we can and cannot do. It's going to say, hey, we're running out of fuel. We're going to basically have to put this one in, because it is not going to stay at the level that we're at. So that's kind of what starts to happen when you start to feel that like drop in overall wattage or whatever that you're doing. You're unable to maintain the same intensity, is because the body's essentially running out of that ability to continue onwards. So it's a good thing that it does that, because just like anything else, we can't function without a fuel source. So the body's basically going to say, hey, you have to turn this down. And we need to get back to a level that we can manage and bring balance or homeostasis back into the system. And then we can talk about returning to higher activity, which is where like interval training is kind of neat, because when you do like a high intensity interval for 30 seconds and then you rest for say 90 seconds, you are basically playing that game of like, I'm gassing myself out as much as possible But then I'm going to let that energy and everything re-regulate back up to where it needs to go. I'm going to let the CO2 and oxygen rebalance, and then I'm going to do it again. And that increases our tolerance for that type of stress, and it helps your body be able to regulate those things better. But ultimately, with the mouth breathing, we don't want to be mouth breathing just willy-nilly. Mouth breathing is something that comes when we're at a higher intensity, but if we're sitting at our desk just breathing out your mouth, like I was mentioning, that's not wonderful. And this also gets into another time where we mouth breathe a lot, which would be in our sleep, which that's where a lot of issues of snoring, sleep apnea, and stuff like that come into play. And we start to have major issues when we're sleeping, which sleep should be our number one recovery tool, something that needs to be locked in and really good to help us essentially feel the best that we can. I mean, everybody knows if they get bad sleep, you can feel the difference. So with that being said, there's certain things that can kind of help that out. Mouth taping is one of those things. This is something that I've been on a journey with for many, many years. I want to say, honestly, almost like over 3 years of doing. I started by reading a book called The Oxygen Advantage, which first kind of introduced me to it. And then there's also the book Breath by James Nestor that goes over all this sort of stuff as well. One's a little more sciencey, The Oxygen Advantage, very sciencey. The one by James Nestor is a little bit more storytelling, but it's like his anecdotal experience through all this stuff. Super great books, both of them wonderful. So that was my introduction into it. And I started with like a system that taped around my mouth to try and keep my lips closed. That worked fairly decent. The tape was a little bit agitating. So then I moved on to using just like a strip of tape across my lips, which is also a really effective way of doing it. And now there's a lot of companies that are creating pieces of tape that like go over your whole mouth. So with the piece over the whole mouth, I find that to be one of the most effective ways personally, but I do cut a hole in the middle. So I'll like fold it in half, kind of like I'm cutting out like a like snowflake back in the day, and just cut out a little hole so that I don't get as claustrophobic, but also so I could put a straw in there if I need to take a drink of water in the middle of the night. So that works really well though, to keep the lips closed throughout the night, and allows you to do nasal breathing throughout the night, which, as I've mentioned, helps with the parasympathetic nervous system, which is going to be important for rest and digestion and recovery. It increases your diaphragmatic breathing, which is important for many things, but also helps with the relaxation of your system. And also it's going to increase that NO, like I talked about. So more nitric oxide, better circulation, better recovery, all this stuff. So, yeah, that's kind of the biggest thing I would say is if you're mouth breathing a lot, I get it throughout the day, sitting at your desk, putting a piece of tape over your mouth is probably not going to be the way to do it. But I do think trying out mouth tape for sleep is a wonderful thing. If you're comfortable with it, if you feel like it's something that is good for you and you've talked to the right people and stuff like that. I'm not saying blindly go do it. But if you're interested in doing it, I would definitely, do some research and learn a little bit more about it. But it's definitely been a big helper for me, and also has, just been a journey for me, which I'm all about the journey. So really cool stuff there. But ultimately, at the end of the day, when comparing nostril breathing, nasal breathing to mouth breathing, nasal breathing is what we should be doing. The nose is the breathe hole. The mouth is the feed hole, is what I've always said. So remember that. Try and breathe through your nose throughout the day. It'll increase your energy. You'll feel better. It'll increase your recovery, make you feel better. So just some tidbits right there. Hope you enjoyed watching or listening to this performance bite, and I'll catch you in the next one.